Running Sentences presents The Madhouse Job. Part 4. Things are off. When his uncle appears in front of him, Jasper finds things dragging him down a complicated maze of doom. This is a work of fiction. Any names, characters, businesses, places, and events are products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to people, actual people, living dead, events, real events, and incidences is purely a coincidence. Copyright 2021, Michael Hunnery. All rights reserved. Jasper blinked. The alleyway. Resented. A weird and odd sight. The last person he expected to see was his uncle, after all this madness and accusations, and of course the dreams he'd been having. "I'll explain, but we need to get away from here." "Please hurry, Mr. Hughes. My father is ransacking his way through the staff to discover who it was who was with me." "Why?" "I don't know. He went mad when he took over this place 20 years ago. At least that's what my mother told me. Now anything that might threaten his place sets him off." "Can we please go now?" Port had already started moving towards the car as a police whistle sounded in the background. Where were they going to go? They obviously couldn't get off the island, as Mr. Locke would have shut that down. That thought was of little comfort to him, but he also thought that Locke, who controlled the island, would tell the police that they didn't need to be kind to him or anything like that, and he found a few stumbled steps had him going forward. His mind was made up, even if he wasn't fully aware of it yet. He clambered into the vehicle with the other two, curious to know what they were doing and what was going on. The car gunned it once they were all inside, the wheels squealing with Johanna's heavy foot on the gas, which caused Jasper to slide about in the back of the car. When he managed to settle down, despite the desperate turns and the winding, bumpy roads, he looked at the front seat where Port and Johanna sat. Port was looking back at him. "Well, Port, what answers do you have? Do you have any?" "No, but yes, and maybe I have some answers." "It would help if you didn't think of matters in black and white, Mr. Hughes." "That doesn't set the mood very well for answers." "But it will help. The thing is, I didn't kill your family." "I've heard that claim before, but not from you personally, and it was, I believe, your lawyer in court." "I was across the state at the time that everything happened. I couldn't and wouldn't, even if I dreamed it all up, kill any of your family." "Then you have someone you want to think is at fault? Then you have someone you think is at fault, or what is this?" "Yes, but it is me." Jasper looked at his uncle and then over to Johanna, who was concentrating hard on the road. He wanted to ask what in the world Port meant by this, but his mind simply didn't want to work it out. So he quieted down and zoned out to think about it, though this was shortly interrupted by the squeaky brakes of the car as they lurched to a stop. The front window of the car was filled with a view of a ramshackle house. The three got out of the car with Johanna and Port not waiting around and heading for the front door. Jasper was following along a bit like a lost puppy in search of a new home, only to be left behind. He mounted up the stairs to this house as memories of his own family home came streaming back to him. It all felt too familiar, and he wasn't sure he liked that. This all went away when he saw the interior of the place. The stairs here were in a bad place, and there was dust and spiderwebs all over the foyer of the place. Aside from that, Johanna was right next to him and leaned over to kiss his cheek. "Thank you for trusting us so far. This is the old escape house, but we don't have much time here." "Escape house?" "Used by runaways to get away from one of those chasing them. Like slaves, though I don't know the exact history of the place, or if it ever was used in such a way. Maybe it was escapees from the mental hospital." She grabbed his hand and gently pulled him deeper into the place. They'd promptly headed downwards into the basement, with Jasper utterly lost as to what was happening and why everything was happening. Port had disappeared, leaving Johanna leading him through the dusty, dank space that was filled with old things that always just seemed to be in the way. She led him to the small section of the basement which looked like a wine storage area with racks gently pushed to the side to reveal a secret passageway. Because, of course, there was. He pulled his hand away. I'm sorry, I need to understand something. This is a lot to take in. She stopped in the doorway to the passage and turned with a concerned look on her face. At first she didn't speak, looking like she was listening for something, and then once it seemed okay, looked at him. About your uncle. Yes, and many other things as well. Well, your uncle did not commit the murder of your family. And before you ask why I know this, it is because I was with him when the murders happened. Your uncle was investigating the island, and I heard about it and got curious, and so on. Not that I don't believe you, but that sounds convenient. Yes, I suppose it is, but I can't prove it to you right now, as I don't have receipts and signatures and so on that would certify this through another person. But it did happen. Then why does he claim it was him? Well, I think that he thinks that my father found out and did his usual overreaction. There was a patient who was freed a few days before, who is similar build and size to your uncle, who also happens to have a preference for cutting everything up. And with that she began walking down the passageway. It was barely lit with the string of lights that were behind the secret wine rack door, and he unconsciously had begun following. When he realized that he was doing this, he didn't stop himself, as there was more potential for answers, though it seemed a far-fetched thing. So it doesn't really give me much suggestion of what's going on. Was there somebody similar to Port who committed the murders? Is that what you're saying? And where are we going? A boat that will whisk you away. Not my uncle? Not you? I can't leave, as my father will only hunt for me further. Your uncle I cannot answer for, but he seems to think that there is something in the hospital worth investigating. And thus you have another reason to stay, your grand mystery. She shrugged as she arrived at the end of the passage, and began groping her way towards a wall until she felt something, and pressed it. The wall in front of her swung open. The sound of a motor being brought to life, and water slapping against rocks, greeted Jasper as he stepped through from the passage. He found himself in a cavern that looked like a passageway, and was barely lit, so making it hard to see anything. But there was definitely a boat, and a dock, and what looked to be a captain, who'd dropped them off the other day. Jasper found himself turning towards her, for some more answers. I need you to go find the reporter, Chris Newell. He might be able to help us. Fine, on the condition that you answer 2 questions. Yes, I will answer, but only if you ask them quickly. Why is your father going through all this effort to potentially hide firing people? I think his theory is always it's easier to justify firing some people when it looks like you're letting go of a whole bunch of people at the same time. That still doesn't make any sense. I'm still a new employee. All he'd have to say is that I'm not living up to expectations, and off I go if he knew it was me. The second thing, unrelated to that, is to the figure that we both saw in the diner. It looks like Port. Unfortunately, I don't have any answers on why that, or about that. I think, yes, it did look like him, but whoever it was certainly wasn't the man that I know. He watched as she retreated back the way she'd come, leaving him with the captain. This was only a small boat and didn't look like it would make for a nice trip across. Jasper approached the floating dock that was moving up and down with the pattern of the incoming waves. In order to get off, we need to row until we are out of sound distance. It will take some time. Jasper looked at the captain and then the small dinghy, which did have a motor attached to the back of it. More prominently, though, it had at least 4 sets of oars tucked inside. He could already feel the burning sensation in his back and arms from the idea of pushing water out of the way. Still, there was a need to get out of here, and so he would. They rowed and rowed the oars for a long time. Jasper's arms burned from the start. It wasn't that he didn't get any exercise, just that he never concentrated on his arms and back, then corrected the thought in his mind as he didn't ever really get any workouts. Finally, the captain reached back and yanked a cord on the engine, bringing it to life. Jasper, with barely enough energy, dragged the oar back in with his tired arms. This little dinghy boat began puttering its way towards land. It was very dark by the time their little raft bumped its way into the dock landing at Colchester town. Jasper jumped off onto the poorly lit dock and was instantly tossed a rope by the captain. He did his best to tie down the boat to a pole, but not knowing any boat knots, he wrapped the rope around the pole and held it while the captain had gotten off the boat and then took it away from him. "Sorry, I don't..." But as he said this, the captain merely waved him away. With nothing else to do, he found himself wandering down the dock, looking out for any hint of what he was to do now. When he arrived at the end of the dock and walked a short distance towards the road, and found that there was no sidewalk to walk along, the only light came from a nearby billboard sign announcing the motel that he'd stayed at the other day was being renovated. A set of lights appeared down the road, illuminating the area and around Jasper, and showed him that there was little other than the dock itself and the little side shoulder of the road. He turned to see if the captain was around, but he had vanished, and the sound of a car rapidly approaching drew him back to the road, as he stepped away to make sure he wasn't in the way. A second later, the vehicle rushed past in a whoosh, leaving Jasper in the dark once again. With no sense of direction, he turned right and began to follow at what little of it he could see. He'd been walking for a while, unsure how much time had or had not passed, or even if he was making any distance up, when he began to see lights ahead. He briefly feared that there was a pack of cars sent after him by Locke. He had no idea why the thought had occurred to him, other than that there was a mix of many things happening, and it was hard to keep it all straight. He went to hide in the woods by the side of the road, keeping his way off to the side. But the lights only got nearer when he moved, and he realized that it was a town in front of him. With the notion firmly in his mind, he returned to the side of the road and headed for it. The long walk had finally brought him to the edge of this place, only it wasn't Colchester that he figured that he was headed towards. The sign for this town said "Welcome to Holly Spruce Townville." It looked very middle New England, and much like Colchester had. Things were organized and looked nice, yet there were so many trees and forests. It seemed like someone had chosen a random piece of land in the middle of the woods to settle a town by. Still, it was a town, and there might be somewhere to sit for a few minutes. He found himself near the town green, a small square space that had a few benches around it and the shops surrounding the green. Everything was closed, however, because it was the night, and as he went to go near the benches, he saw that they were designed so that you wouldn't sit on them. So he sat next to them and closed his eyes to relax, if only for a little while. A jolt woke him up as he found himself not next to a bench, but riding in the back of a car. A man in a tall, brimmed hat and a very fancy-looking uniform sat in front as they drove down the road. Jasper sat up, which drew the attention of the man. "Morning." Who are you, and why am I in the back of your car, where I don't want to be?" "I'm Sheriff Lewis Barber of the little old town." "Why were you sleeping next to the bench?" The benches didn't look inviting." "Ha! That's a fair assessment of them. Now, why are you here?" "I wish I knew the answer to that." "You ain't from that loony bin of an island, are you?" No, I got lost driving last night, and then my car broke down. I went trying to walk to see if I could find a town nearby, and by the time I did, well, I was exhausted." The car slowed to a stop and then pulled into a driveway that was leading down a hidden road. "Well, you can sort it out with the mayor, who's also our judge." The driveway snaked and went up and down a few little hills. Jasper wondered where this was all leading to, as the woods had closed in around the poor dirt road that often seemed more like patches of grass. After a while, a clearing came into view, along with a lake, and a large house with a porch guarded by tall columns and a porch out front. The car lumbered its way toward the house. When they came to a stop, the sheriff got out of the car, and then let Jasper out of the back seat, as the back door couldn't be opened from the inside. Once back out, Jasper stretched for a second, but this was met by a stare from the cop, so he cut it short. "The mayor knows you're coming, so don't waste our time. or hers. She doesn't like it when people waste time. Jasper signaled for the cop to lead the way, which is exactly what Louis Barber did. They soon stood on the porch with the sheriff ringing the house doorbell, which sounded throughout the house and out to them. At least that's the way it felt to Jasper, who took a step back when he could hear the loud bell ringing heavily even out here. Louis Barber seemed to ignore this, and Jasper found himself taking a step even further back to see if the bell wasn't actually outside ringing instead of inside. And then the door was ripped open, with a steaming mad and disheveled woman stepping out and glaring at them. "Sheriff!" "I brought you the sleeping man from the green." "Oh, that? Yes, bring him in." She stepped back and they walked in. Inside was not as grand-looking as the exterior, as things took on a crooked look. The foyer was well maintained and clean, but everything looked off. Jasper noted that the many things inside this room, from pots to paintings and anything that held anything or was just there, was all angled or pointed in different directions. The sight made his head spin. However, thankfully they didn't seem to be staying in this room for very long, as the mad woman marched across the foyer and lobby area to a door on her right. She then threw this door open as well, as they all went into here. Jasper came to a stop when he entered the lounge area of the house. It was bright, with wide, large windows facing the room, the whole room feeling much different from the foyer. The mad lady headed for a bar tucked off into the corner, followed by the sheriff. Jasper, however, stared at Vera Langsong, his co-worker, and a rather pensive, nervous man who sat on the couch beside her, near the windows. "Oh, you escaped." "I did." The pensive man jumped up from the couch and came over, offering his hand to shake. Jasper offered his and was met with a nervous and slightly sweaty palm that almost instantly disappeared the second it began shaking. "Chris Newell, I'm the reporter, the one who contacted you about the man who might not have killed your family." "Nice to meet you. What are you doing here?" "Same as you. Got lost and found my way here." "How did you know I got lost?" "It's the only way to get to Holly Spruce. We're lost in time to the world unless you're very careful to drive right past us on your way to Colchester." This mare lady, that he figured was the mare, came back with a drink in her hand and offered it to Jasper, who at first just looked at it. Knowing that she wanted him to take it, he gently reached out for it. "This lake and the island and Colchester must be cursed, then, Miss Mare and Mr. Newell and anyone?" Yes. This is what my book explains. This area is under some kind of magic spell, like many lost early towns of New England. They were there, and then suddenly they were gone, abandoned, with signs of life having vanished. But life had been fine up until the moment that someone came to check on them." "So this isn't about sleeping on the green, then, I take it?" "No, we need you to break the curse on our little abode." Okay, Miss Mare. Why? Me?" Vera stood up, straightening out her dress. "We believe you have a strong imagination. I've heard you've had nightmares, and they are very loud and can be heard by those who live near you in the dorms of our hospital. Whatever you're seeing in those nightmares can be used to see the unseen." Vera then walked over to the bar as well and retrieved a drink that was similar to his, as did Chris. Jasper looked between them and then turned to the mare once again. This drink is the way back." "Very good, Mr. Hughes. Very good indeed. Now, if you'll please drink up. Oh, and when you wake up, please look up the name Betsy Hardnock and Louis Barber. You'll probably find some interesting facts about us, no doubt." He shrugged and took a swig of his drink. The worst that could happen was his death, which by this point would be a welcome thing since it was easier to understand. The faint sound of purring and wetness on his face made Jasper open his eyes. He found a set of yellow eyes in his face and nearly jumped up in shock. This was greeted by a meow and a hiss, and then the eyes were gone. The fleeting sight of a stray cat hurried away from him. He blinked as he found himself in the woods, which was not where he was expecting to be, The road wasn't far away, and judging from the sound of cars as he got to his feet, he could also just about make out the dock that would lead to the ferry back to the island, not terribly far away. He looked around and found himself beside what could only be described as a big burly bush that looked something like a bench. He rose unsteadily to his feet, blinking and wondering if he'd just had a terrible dream. But there was the inkling thought that it wasn't stuck with him as he headed for the road, all because he could still remember the name Betsy Hardknock and Louis Barber. Usually, the names in dreams went away in an instant. He traveled quite a ways down the road, his legs tiring from all of the walking, when he finally saw the sign signaling Greater Colchester was a half a mile away. He sped up his walking in the hopes of getting there sooner, and then realized that he hadn't been dropped off in Colchester by the ferry dock. No, he'd been dropped further down the lake. It was very weird. He had expected to go straight to Colchester, but the captain hadn't taken him straight there. He wondered why, but he was more interested in getting to town at this exact moment, as his legs just about gave out as he reached the town green, which was also very square-like and similar to holly spruce. Jasper looked about to make sure that things were definitely different. Unfortunately, it had that quaint old town feel that made all old towns feel the same-ish. His train of thoughts were broken by a squeal of tires as a car came to a stop by the green. Its front window rolled down to reveal Vera Langsong, who had pulled down her sunglasses to look over at him. "There you are. Get in." Jasper, whose legs had given out a second ago, sat on the ground. His legs did not want to move anymore. That was until the other side of the car popped open, and out popped Elise, looking steaming mad. "Get in now." She was half round about the car when he did manage to get to his feet. He could also clearly see that Chris Newell was in the car as well, in the back. There was the pensive, nervous man glanced over with pleading eyes. "Wait a second. Stop for a minute." Elisa came to a stop and cocked her head, confused. "Jasper Hughes, what is wrong?" It's all too easy, convenient. It doesn't, well, it doesn't make sense, but it's the curse talking, Jasper. It's trying to cover up the gaping hole that you've put in it. Why would a curse care? That's what we're trying to find out. Now please trust us and get in the car." Elise had come around now and had grabbed his arm. The back window had rolled down and Chris had poked his head out the window. "If you don't mind, we have to travel far to meet Von Baum." "I already talked to him. He doesn't want to talk." Elise tugged at his arm once and pulled him towards the car. "That's because you were talking to him with Johanna. If it is with us, though, he will surely talk." She was now gently guiding him towards the car. It was almost imperceptible, but he clearly saw that she had some sort of small jar in her other hand. The smell coming from it, made him just want to follow her. As soon as he was in the seat next to Chris and the bottle was in his hand, Jasper found that he couldn't think very well, as it all just turned very foggy. To this, his mind decided it would be best to just close his eyes. So he did. When he came back to his senses, he found himself seated in a greenhouse, with Chris next to him, but neither of the girls were around. Jasper looked about and then settled down in his chair and faced Chris Newell. "Well, Mr. Newell, I have no idea what's going on anymore, and you're to blame, because you're here. So either you can tell me stuff now, or I can run away." "It's a bad idea to run away. They don't like it when you run away." "They, meaning?" "Holly Spruce. I have a theory that the two ladies are from there and escaped to our timeline. We have to help them, or they will drag us down into the pits of their timeline, where we will forever be stuck until death." "What does that have to do with a hospital or at your port, Mr. Chris? You're just talking." "I think they're being used by the other world to get what they want, what it wants." At this point, a bunch of footsteps loudly interrupted them, as a butler walked through the maze of a greenhouse to find them. The man came to a stop in front of them and offered a slight bow. "The gentleman, Mr. von Baum, wishes to see you. If you'll please follow me." The butler stood up as Chris stood up, and then looked at Jasper, signaling for him to get up as well. Jasper, for his part, didn't like any of this, as it was all just one thing on top of another, with no solutions. If there was anything worse in the world than a puzzle with no solutions, he didn't want to know about it. So he reluctantly stood up. There might be answers. So he had to follow what was given to him. The butler turned sharply, and they followed him out of this greenhouse area. They entered into the house of von Baum, and quickly crisscrossed their way across it to get to the stairs, soon getting to the upstairs hallway, where they were stopped next to a door. Vera and Elise soon exited the room, with them stopping just outside the door. The butler then ushered in Chris, while Jasper found himself forced to wait outside. He threw glances about, peeking over at Elisa in case she tried something, and decided that he was hers again, and that she was not going to let him out of her sight. But she seemed cold and distant, not her usual clingy self that she presented herself as. He found himself looking more and more over at her, trying to figure out if this person was the same one he knew, or if they were some holly spruce weirdness, or just his imagination. He didn't get much further into that thought as the door opened again, and he found himself ushered in. He entered a bedroom, when he'd been expecting an office or a library or a reading room of some sort. The location, and Mr. Baum sitting on his bed, tending to his foot in his pajamas, threw his thoughts out the window as he tried to figure out why. Von Baum seemed unperturbed, and eventually put his foot back down. "Ah, you. I should have guessed that you were the savior that Vera and Elise wanted to crow about. Alas, you aren't, and this shall all fail. But it is no skin off my nose. Holly Spruce will not rise. We will find someone else to make the hospital weirdness go away. But I did go to Holly Spruce. Did you know, Mr. Hughes? Well, then there is some hope for you, but it doesn't help me." "So I'm to be thrown away then?" "Yes, I think you shall be thrown away, and we shall deal with that soon enough." Then please, Mr. Baum, Mr. Tree, I should say, tell me one last thing before I walk off this plank to La La Land. What's going on with the hospital?" "Oh, it's rather simple. I'm surprised your imagination hasn't gotten it into gear yet. The place is being swallowed by the same thing that made Holly Spruce disappear." This, of course, did not answer Jasper's question. It just made more information on top of information, which was unsorted out. It was then that a rough set of hands grabbed Jasper from behind, and he turned to find the butler roughly dragging him away through another door in the bedroom. He was propelled through a back hallway that was too narrow for two people, and to which Jasper figured was some sort of secret passage, then hallway. But since there was no room for anything, or any trickery that he might try, he hurried along, unable to get away from the surprising grasp of this butler. After the hallway, he found himself being carefully led down the stairs, and through the house, and then back into the greenhouse of all places. There he was marched along the path towards the end of it, when the butler finally came to a stop, and stopped him as well. Jasper found himself facing a glass wall and plants all around. There was no doorway or anything, but the butler had let him go, so there was a small bright side. This quickly diminished as he heard a loud creaking, a very heavy thunk, and when he turned around, he found that the butler had opened a secret passageway in the path floor. It went down via a ladder, and without hesitation, Jasper turned and headed downward, figuring it would be quicker to just go along with this. At the end of the 20 or so odd foot ladder, Jasper found a tunnel which had 7 branching pathways. Each of these tunnel paths had a sign above them, reading some gibberish. Holly Spruce, Hospital for the Mental, Port Harbor, Colchester, Bolts, Victor's house and home, in case you're wondering what they said." Jasper looked over at the butler, surprised that he was sharing any information as he dismounted this ladder. Then the man pointed towards the tunnel with the words "home." "We are going this way." The butler did not grab him again, but simply walked towards the tunnel. "Oh, and once the top grate is shut, it stays closed for a week or so. It will be a long wait, so please do come along." The tunnel was quiet, aside from the occasional echo that bounded about from their footsteps. The eeriness of it, no, the quietness, was rather distracting to Jasper, who kept looking about, expecting things to jump out at him. The butler had once again decided that talking was bad, and despite a few questions thrown his way, he didn't speak. So on they plodded, Jasper looking for something in the well-lit cavern that occasionally had shadows thrown about, while the butler marched onward unperturbed. They came into a room that looked much like a bedroom. In fact, it looked like his bedroom from his home, the home that he'd left because the house had become the site of a murder. Only there were machines there, and these machines were hanging around the bed. They seemed very hospital-like. The butler went over to a machine and started working on it, turning it on and then waking them up, and then moving on to another one to wake that one up as well. "You should lie on the bed. It will all be over in a few seconds." "This is an execution chamber." No, though you'd be surprised how many people think that it is. This room projects what your mind thinks of. For me, what I see is a office study with a relaxing couch. I don't know what it is for you, though. Apparently, when von Baum found it, the room already existed and was a simple, plain room. Then he stepped into the room and everything changed. So I'm not to be killed? Not by me, no. You'll have to survive your dreams, though. These machines will help magnify and see if you have the imagination or not that we need. I thought that Baum didn't believe that I had an imagination. Oh, I don't believe he believes in you now, but he will have a test run just to make sure that he isn't wrong. Now, if you'd please sit on the thing shaped like a bed or a couch. It's a couch for me, might be a bed for you, it might be something else. Jasper went over to the bed and sat down. His dreams were going to kill him? The thought went through and through his mind as he found himself lying on this, what he thought was a bed, but now wasn't entirely sure what it was. The butler towered over him and attached some probes about his skull and to his arm, then waved to him once he'd finished. Nighty-night. His eyes shut for the merest of seconds, and when he opened them again, he found himself sitting in his family living room. The place was clean, and was exactly as he remembered it. No, not exactly. There was still a soft brown leather couches surrounding a box-set TV, a comfortable rug under his feet, except it felt all wrong. It was as if he'd gone back in time to before he was born. But that couldn't be, and as if to prove his point, his father walked through the room, but was younger, almost like the pictures Jasper had seen of him. His dad was quickly through, and as Jasper stood up and moved to follow, he wanted to talk to his father. As he followed him, they went into the kitchen, which felt much like the living room, similar but older than he remembered it, just a slight bit out of date with an older stove and fridge, from being the first signs that this was not quite right to him. Jasper followed the man, and as he looked about, and was surprised when he came to a stop right in the center of the kitchen, and gave a hug to his Uncle Port. The two began to talk, with their mouths moving rapidly as they separated, but Jasper couldn't hear what was going on. They were getting more and more animated, with a few pushes here and there. Finally, having enough of this, his uncle stormed out of the room. Douglas, Jasper's dad, however, hadn't seemed to have enough, and went after him. Hey, you two, Jasper tried to call out, but the words seemed to stick to his back of his throat. His father stopped and looked around, confused, like he'd heard something, then went after his brother. Jasper, of course, followed them into the afternoon sun and shielded his eyes from the harshness of it, plus the oppressive summer heat was just a lot once he stepped out. He took a minute to settle down and get comfortable, to see that his father and his uncle were once again fighting. And once again there was no noise coming from them, although their mouths were moving. It was a mess of pushes until Port threw a punch that sent Douglas sprawling. Then his uncle stormed off. Jasper could only stand and watch from the deck as his father soon got back to his feet and charged right through him back into the house. Having turned to follow, Jasper once again entered the kitchen, but stopped. It was different once again. More modern, but only slightly. The refrigerator drew his attention with a variety of magnets stuck to it, and drawings being held in place by those magnets. He looked about for his father, but he did not see the man, and charged out of the kitchen towards his father's office. Whenever he was young, that's always where his dad would be. A step into the living room led to night and the glowing of a TV on his sister, Becca, who was sitting on the couch paying attention only to her boyfriend, who Jasper did not recognize. He moved onward towards the next room. When he entered the hallway that led to the other side of the house, a morning sunlight cast its shadows at the sounds of people shuffling about upstairs, which greeted him. He wondered why sound was now coming through as he walked creaking hallway. The pictures on the walls were all of his later teenage years, and mostly were of his family, and quite a few were happy ones, where everyone seemed to be getting along. The sight of his uncle and father fighting came back to him in this fleeting moment. He'd never seen them argue with one another, though they did seem rather distant to one another any time that there was a visit. He'd gotten to the end of the hallway and stopped. The doorway he faced led to his father's downstairs study, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to step through to see what was next. His hand had found the doorknob and twisted it, and he tried to push it open. It didn't budge. He rattled the door trying to see if it was stuck, which he had to do when he was a kid, but no, it was locked. The only other entrance was to clamber through a window from the outside. He turned and hurried back down the hallway. Having hurried his way back around, Jasper found himself outside of the door to the kitchen, leading out to the backyard. His hand had already opened the door by the time he glanced around to look at things, and they looked like they'd aged a bit of yellowness to some of the appliances, and a now clean fridge with no magnets. The place had taken on a well-lived look to it. His stomach turned as more unpleasant memories came rushing back to him from the day he'd found the murders. He stepped outside to avoid this. As he hurried his way to the side of the house, counting windows until he arrived at the fourth one, near the end of the wall. There, as usual, was the vine ladder that went up the side of the house, with a creeping vine heading up as well. It was all very cliché, and yet it supported a fair amount of weight if Jasper remembered correctly, although only for short amounts of time. So he clambered up until he was level with the window, and he found it was opened a bit, and that it did not have its usual screen to it, which was a welcome thing, but also a bit weird. The window was open, there was no screen. The creaking of the vine ladder warned him that things were not happy, and so he pushed the window fully open as best he could, and then jumped off, so that the ladder could relax. Once back on the ground, he searched nearer to the house and found, hidden among the bushes, the screen that had been forcefully pushed out from the looks of it. Jasper looked up and wondered if, the way time was going in this dream, that he'd arrived at the moment of murder, that moment where his world went to hell in this house. The sinking feeling in his stomach told him yes, as he decided to head back to the vine ladder and clamber his way upwards. His feet landed on the hardwood floor of the office study with a thud. The noise echoed about the empty room that was filled with books and files. Jasper was surprised that the room felt so empty, as the door had been locked, and this was where his dad spent most of the time, so why did it not feel like it was lived in anymore? He went over to the door to check the lock to see if it was in fact locked, which made him pause and look about. The books on the shelves looked disturbed, like they'd been moved in a search for things. He turned his attention to the desk, where papers were strewn about, but generally how he remembered it. But the safe should be... He wandered over to the desk and knelt down so that he could push aside the chair, and crawled under the desk base and grabbing at the wooden floor. There he opened a small hatchway, which contained a safe, or should have, as it was missing. Instead, there was just piles of manila folders. Taking a second, he looked over these plain folders and grabbed the top one to open it. Dr. Port was noted for being involved in the opening of a mental asylum on an island. He helped Dr. Locke realize his dreams in bringing a space for the mental patients and conducting important tests on how much these people could be trusted. His reading was interrupted by the heavy steps heading upstairs. Jumping up, Jasper held onto the file as he rushed towards the door. The heavy steps continued as Jasper emerged from the study office into the hallway. The steps sounded like someone was walking up and down the stairs continuously for some odd reason, but when Jasper got over to the staircase, he found it empty of anyone. Confused and curious, he clambered up the stairs, wondering if it was his imagination playing tricks on him, but he could swear that the shadows were moving in the afternoon sun in the upstairs hallway as he tried to go up there. He arrived at the top of the stairs. He looked about to see which doors were closed and what felt familiar and trying to locate where things were. The door to his right would be his bedroom, the one on his left his brother's. Further on the left was his sister's. Then at the very end, the door was creaking open, just a smidge. That one was his parents' room. He gathered his breath as he stepped towards it. His nerves felt like going to jelly, and they were suddenly wobbling about, and it took him a minute to get down the short hallway to push the door open. A streak of red being the first sight he saw. Jasper stepped into this room, not knowing what to expect aside from blood splatters. The sight was there, strewn all across the room. And then there was Edgar Port, his uncle, sitting calmly on the bed with quite a few splatters of blood on him and his nice suit. He stood up at the sight of Jasper and stared straight at him. "Oh, so you've finally arrived. Please come with me. I have someone you need to meet." Port began quickly walking over to him and then past him, and as Jasper was just stood there, rooted in position. "How? Why?" Then shook his head. A dream could do what it wants, however it wants to do it. He turned to see that Port was already gone, and decided, well, his dream was taking him somewhere, so he might as well follow it. They headed downstairs, and then continued until they'd gotten to the staircase leading to the basement. Port seemed uninterested in talking about anything, and Jasper was content to let the silence reign. He'd been trying to take peeks at the file, still in his hands, but that was proving to be a difficult task, and anyway, the walk didn't take that long before they found themselves heading down the staircase. The basement itself was dark and cool. It had a single light, which was only go on from a drawstring in the center of the room. When Port clicked that light on, Jasper found himself in the usual space he'd known. The basement had been made semi-hospitable down here by his mom. The walls were done up so that the cement didn't show, and there were more fictional books lined up on bookcases than the local library along the walls. At least that's what his mom had always proudly proclaimed. The single light cast its shadow over sitting chairs and bookcases. Port had turned to him. "Well, Uncle, what is it you wanted to show me?" Port pointed behind him, and Jasper turned to see a mirror. There was never a mirror there before, and Jasper looked at Port, who stood there with his hands held out to his side. There were no weapons that were visible, but never to trust an initial impression, Jasper narrowed his own eyes. "So what about this mirror?" "Please go up and see for yourself, my young nephew." Jasper made his way over towards the mirror and stared at it. He realized that something was off in the reflection, as he was not in there. And he could clearly see Port standing there, but the room in the mirror was empty. "This has to be dream magic, a nice trick, but you can't fool me. I am in a dream." "Is it now? Do you have proof that it isn't some idea that I thought up to scare myself with or something?" Port held his hand out, pointing towards the nearby shadows of the bookcase. A man emerged from the darkness as the light took hold, revealing a spitting image of Edgar Poet. Slowly, the man came to stand next to his uncle. "Jasper, I would like you to meet Edgar Port, and he is from the Mirror. Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Jasper. We have so much to do." "Uncle, this isn't proof of anything." "Oh, well, perhaps this will help." Edgar pulled a knife out of his suit jacket. It was covered in blood, and despite the fact that the blood looked dried, there was a nasty glint to this Bowie knife, and Edgar grinned as he rapidly approached Jasper. End of part 4. Thank you for listening.